Here at the South Broadway Library. First off, I want to thank the Friends for the Public Library as well as the Albuquerque Public Library Foundation, whose support and contributions allow us to have programs like the one that we're going to be having today. Today we're going to be talking about pollinators. Butterflies, bees, and other pollinators provide us with 1 out of every 3 bites we eat. Not only are they important to our gardens, but also to our entire ecosystem. Kristin Thompson will be presenting our program today. Kristin was born in Las Cruces and has lived most of her life here in New Mexico. She loves gardening, she's a nature lover, and has a growing passion for pollinators. So let's now welcome Kristin.
Thank you. Could everyone hear me? Good, all right. I started watering, I think, when I was 3 years old. I grabbed a hose in the backyard, and then we had a little irrigation ditch. And by the time I was 6, I was in charge of that to water the backyard. And in Las Cruces, we were close to the river, so we had lots of hummingbirds in the summertime. If you live close to the river here, you know that you have quite a few more than the people up in the foothills. That goes for pollinators, although at this point we're losing so many of them. It has to do with climate change, whether you believe in it or not. It is changing. You can tell our temperatures are warmer. We haven't had snow on the ground like we did before. Pesticides, herbicides, all of those things, even when they say that they'll break up and disappear within hours or a couple of days, it just doesn't happen. It builds up because people reuse them. Also, because they're sold so freely everywhere, all the big box stores, and it is more of a diluted solution. The people who are using them a lot of times don't understand that there can always be a drift when you're spraying. Even if there's not a breeze, some people are out there when there's a little bit of a breeze in the morning or in the evening, and just a few drops. It was 2 years ago, early in the spring, I went out one morning and noticed that there was absolutely nothing outside. And for the next couple of weeks, there wasn't a bee in sight at my house, and I have flowers everywhere. I'm a pollinator lover, so I'm doing everything I possibly can to get them there. There wasn't anything. And what I found out later was the city was spraying early in the morning, and there was a huge drift. It had come across several neighborhoods. I found out that, and this was all just around and about, but someone had ordered the wrong pesticide for the city. It was something that was too strong, and instead of returning it, they said, well, we'll just use it up and then we'll get what we need. Well, they used it all over the city. This was 2 years ago, and ended up, I was helping. I was doing a lot of volunteering at the city greenhouses, and this is how I was finding out through Parks and Recreation. And it was just one of those mistakes where someone just didn't understand, just didn't know, and it was really a sad situation. They used a pesticide all over town that did a lot of damage. Starting to come back. They've got the right stuff. People are using it. This was at the beginning of the pandemic, and they didn't have the right people working. It was hard, as it still is, to find people to work at any job. I have a part-time job at Home Goods, and I love going there because I love all their fun stuff. Don't go home with a paycheck. But it's the same there during the holidays. Normally they would have something like 150 employees, part-time and full-time, and they had 60. So, and they just couldn't, still everybody. But anyway, back to pollinators. If all of you start doing what you can, and I think that probably if you're here, you already have been doing some of the right things. You're interested in pollinators and interested in learning a little bit more. And if you just tell your neighbors or you make suggestions, then just word of mouth will make a huge difference. So these are two of my favorite pollinators. We see hummingbirds here. Most of these pictures are from my garden. And so occasionally there'll be some that obviously aren't. The monarch that's on the right-hand side was from the butterfly exhibit at the Botanic Garden. And several years ago, before they tore down the structure and rebuilt it, they had fabulous butterfly exhibits. They had exotic butterflies from all over the world, which is what a zoo or botanic garden is supposed to do. After they took that structure down and installed the new one, and it took a year, there were contractor questions and getting it done and delays and everything, but they finally got this beautiful new structure built. And the people in charge decided that they would feature native pollinators. Well, I have native pollinators in my garden. I want to see, everybody does, or you're learning about them. The purpose of an exhibit is to show you the things that we don't see here. And I think that after a year or so, they started to change, and they've been bringing in the more exotic pollinators. Otherwise, we don't learn about them. We don't know that there are other things that we need to protect. But the exhibit was so important before that there were people who came from all over the world to see this exhibit. I did a lot of volunteering there and met people from Germany, from the Scandinavian islands. They came to New Mexico, to Albuquerque, to see that exhibit. It was like one of the top 3 butterfly exhibits in the world. So it was pretty spectacular. And I haven't been back in the last 2 years just because of everything. And I know sometimes it's been closed, but hopefully we're back to that. It's pretty exciting to see some of those butterflies that are down in the tropics, or on an island in Madagascar or someplace like that we'll never see. Some of them are just amazing. Anyway, this fella on the left was in my garden. He was in the middle of it was the middle of the summer. The monarch was at the exhibit. We don't see very many monarchs here. We just aren't in their migration route. We're sort of in it, but as they come up from Mexico, those rascals go either up through Arizona and up to California, or up through Texas and over towards the East Coast. I don't know why they want to go there. But we get a few drifting up through us, but we are not their main migration route, and that's why we don't. You might put out all the milkweed in the world, and you might still not see. I haven't had any in my garden, and it just makes me furious. I do everything, and they just don't read the book. So, now let me make sure I've got the right button here. Okay, so just think about these things. What if we didn't have flowers? What if we didn't have fruit? Fruit without pollinators would probably not exist. There are very, very few self-pollinating fruits. One of the things that we would end up with would be pecans. Pecans, and we have some of the largest orchards in the world down in Las Cruces. They are essentially self-pollinating. The wind can pollinate pecans. So we would have pecans, but forget about almonds, forget about macadamias, forget about the others. We wouldn't have them. We'd have cotton, we'd have corn, we'd have wheat, most of the bland things. And we wouldn't have coffee, and we wouldn't have chocolate. I wouldn't exist without chocolate. So it's estimated, you can look through this, and I think that this information will be on the library website, so you can go back and take a look. But without pollinators, we would have a huge collapse worldwide. The plants would cease to exist. That would mean that the pollinators would not have their host plants. Each pollinator has a certain host plant. They don't go to everything under the sun. And the little caterpillars that evolve, I raise black eastern swallowtails. They're fairly common, so just about everybody has them all over the country. But they have to have, they're very particular, they have to have curly parsley, not flat leaf parsley, curly parsley or fennel. And without those two things, and rue is something too. The eggs are always laid. The mothers who only live a week after going through everything find those 3 plants and lay their eggs. They may lay 300 to 400 eggs. You can imagine, as soon as those eggs are laid, there are spiders, there are little bugs that are just happy to eat those eggs as fast as they can. So by the time the eggs have been there for a couple of weeks and they're trying to get through all that, trying to hope that they didn't get eaten by something, by the time they evolve and they go through the caterpillar stage, finally get to the chrysalis, we may end up with 3 or 4 out of that 300 or 400. It's just, it's an obstacle course for them. So it's very difficult for pollinators. We have to do everything we possibly can. Give them the host plants. Every time I see a black, I guess I've become pretty obsessive about it. I don't like to admit it, but I see a black swallowtail out there in my garden, and I imagine that she's probably laid some eggs. So I go looking, find the eggs. So I either dig up the plant, the parsley, or I have a lot of the parsley growing in pots. I bring it inside, have an area inside where I get a lot of sun. And I keep them in there until they hatch, till the caterpillars go through everything. Because, little kids see green caterpillars crawling across the sidewalk. That's a good thing to play with or smash. That's also when the birds get them. Caterpillars are the main food source for baby birds. So that's another reason why they disappear. But a pollinator moves pollen from a flower to another flower, always of the same species. They're very particular about that. That has to happen. Pollination has to happen for us to get seeds. And without seeds, if we keep using the same, it's just like inbreeding with people or horses or anything else. We end up with a product that is susceptible to disease, to fungus, to all kinds of things, and we end up with plants that just don't have the strength to survive. As I go through this, I'll show you some prime examples of where we lose fertile seeds. But pollinators are not just butterflies and bees and hummingbirds like we see. There are also all kinds of bees, or all kinds of birds, well, all kinds of bees. There are about 20,000, I think, varieties of bees worldwide. We have a lot of them, and we have a lot in our state. Mainly what we're familiar with are honeybees and bumblebees, and there are lots of different, there are a number of different varieties. There are about 6 varieties of honeybees that we're familiar with and that do a lot of the pollinating. But beetles and ants, even, and you'll meet her as we go through, but I have a kitty with a big fluffy tail, and she goes through, and anything like that, raccoons, any animal that's going through might pick up some pollen. And you know, if it's a lucky day, the pollen happens to fall on the right other plant or flower. But all of those are important. Pollinators are always looking for mates. Some of them don't need mates to lay their eggs, and we'll meet some of those. But generally, they're a good pollinator can move around, understands, and this is second nature to them. We learn these things, but they're born to know what they're supposed to go to, what they are supposed to eat. They have scales or hair. Bumblebees are great. They're covered with all these little hairy things, so that the pollen is grabs onto that. And a hummingbird might stick its head way into a trumpet kind of shaped flower, and has no idea that when it comes out, its head is covered with pollen, goes to the next flower and deposits that pollen. So they also have specialized feeding structures. That's their proboscis or the beak or whatever it is. It's specialized. One pollinator can't even possibly get into another type of flower. So we'll learn that. In New Mexico, 300 species of butterflies. You probably see some of them because they're wandering around. A lot of them are out just in the desert, but we have about 1,000 species of bees. The main ones are the honeybees and the bumblebees that you see. But because of bees, we have green chili, we have onions. You might not know that in the spring, New Mexico provides almost 100% of the onions in for the United States. We ship them out. It's one of our main crops in the springtime. I saw that when I lived in Las Cruces. I used to go down to the area south of Las Cruces where they load the boxcars full of onions and chili. Artichokes are grown down there commercially, not as big as California, but that's another one of my things I couldn't live without. Alfalfa is extremely important. It's not a food for us, but without it, we don't, we can't feed cows, we can't feed sheep, we can't feed a lot of things. So without alfalfa, we'd lose a lot of those creatures. I think I'm still reeling from the convoy on the freeway. Anyway, our state is the 7th highest milk and the 8th highest cheese producing state. These things are just kind of, we're oblivious to it because it's all production, but we have, because of the pollinators, and because of what we do, we provide about 50,000 jobs in the state. Without pollinators, we'd lose all of those. This is a beautiful site. I took this picture up in Northern California. I have cousins who live up there and have farms, and we have these valleys in the spring. There are areas that are just covered with wildflowers. It's beautiful, but it's so important because this is where everyone comes to get nectar. They may be migrating and they can see this massive color, so they know where to go. This shows you an example of something you could do in your garden. When you go to the big box store, to the nursery, and you buy a 6-pack of a certain flower, and you're going to plant it, don't put one over here and one over there and one over here. Put them all together so that you have a mass, so that these pollinators can find that. If you've got one little plant over here and one over here, they might be flying around and just miss it, but together they're going to see that massive color. This is what provides nectar for our pollinators. For the birds, for insects, we have to have these areas. Beetles, these are some of the pollinators. Beetles are sort of reckless. I never thought about them as being pollinators until I started studying. You'll see them. This was on a cosmos in my yard, and they're clunky. They fall off the plants. They might stumble onto another one, and then they finally get the pollinating process done. But they are important. They are important for macadamia nuts. They're one of the biggest pollinators for macadamia nuts. This is the black eastern swallowtail. This is the one that I love raising. And you can do it too. They're all over the place. You just have to look. But you also need to put curly parsley. I use it as a filler in my garden. It's beautiful. It's a perennial. It spreads out underneath your flowers and fills in, and it really is wonderful. This is the caterpillar. You'll see it on the parsley, and if you see your parsley disappearing, that's okay. That's why you planted it. You want to have parsley for these little guys, and they'll devour a plant in no time. But they go through the caterpillar stage. It takes about 2 weeks. They get to be about 2 inches big and fat, beautiful like this. And then they just quit eating. They stop and they start to travel. Some of them are just restless. They may travel. I had one that I followed around for 13 hours. And to take him to the greenhouse with me. I had him in the car at the grocery store. But I wasn't about to leave him at home because he was not going, he found a way to get out of the terrarium. I have a couple of little holes, and I just wanted to make sure that he was okay and I knew where he was. I have had them escape. This last year, I lost about 3. I was doing something else, I guess, and not paying attention. And one ended up falling off the table where my terrarium is and going underneath. I have 4 chairs around this table, and they're on rollers. And about 3 days later, I was cleaning, and I looked at this. There was a chrysalis up underneath, right next to the wheel on one of these. So through this winter, I have great big ribbons around that area so that I remember that it's there. But he's hanging there, still waiting. Some chrysalis cannot winter over. Others, like the black swallowtails, if they are late in the fall, they can go through the winter. They can do that outside and then hatch in the spring. And I have about 25 at home right now. I'm keeping them cool, and hopefully in the spring they'll all come out. Butterflies, moths are very important. They do a lot of the pollinating at night. You might not see any of them. The painted lady is a butterfly that we have a lot of around here. About 3 years ago, the temperatures were right, the rainfall was right, and as they were migrating, if you were lucky enough to have them in your garden, I had, it was my, one of my other plants was blooming, and I had so many painted ladies that when I went out, I had to go like this. They were all over me. They were all over the plants. They were everywhere. It was just fabulous.
So what's good to plant for that?
For the painted lady, let me think about it. They, and it's on the tip of my tongue. I'll think of it. The Western Tiger Swallowtail, or the big yellow one that we see a lot of, it likes rue, but doesn't like parsley, doesn't like fennel. So even though they're both swallowtails, the black and the yellow, they have specific different host plants. And this information, amazingly and beautifully, is on the internet. You can go in and just say host plant for butterflies and or for caterpillars, and it's not in my brain or coming at the moment, but it is on the internet, and you can find these things. Some grow quickly than others. You'll see the orange sulfur around here. It's common in our area. The queen butterfly, that's what their caterpillar looks like. It's a little bit different. It's got these black, all of these black antennae coming off of them. The hummingbirds, as you know, like tubular flowers. They like the bright colors. That's the best way to attract them. This is a Mexican free-tailed bat that I had found in southern New Mexico, and they do all of their pollinating at night. They come out of the caves and the other areas close to rivers where they sleep, and they have these long noses. They have tongues that are sometimes longer than their bodies, and they're shaped so that they go into these big, thick, tubular flowers, mainly in cactus, and other plants on trees and things, and do a lot of it. That's the honeybee. Honeybee came from Europe. It's not native to our country, but we now have lots of them. There are about 6 species of honeybees that are the most important, and they do a ton of our fertilizing. This is a female bumblebee. Both of them are. You can see this guy over here has been crawling around and it's covered with pollen. He will eventually clean that. She will eventually, both of them, clean it off. They have 3 sets of legs, and they use that middle set of legs. I'm not good at demonstrating this, but they clean the pollen off their bodies, and then they tuck it in to the area around their kneecaps on the 3rd set of legs. And you can see that's it's called a pollen basket, and it's on the 3rd set of legs. This fella has really packed in the pollen. They will fill up those baskets and then take it back to their nests and take it off their legs and leave it there. It's used for feeding their babies and a number of other things. You can also see the proboscis on this on the bumblebee. They have long proboscis. You can almost always see it if you watch them. They're very docile. They can land on you. The females are the only ones that can sing. So the males are just haphazard flying around. They're not going to do anything. The females are not going to do anything either unless you're really threatening their nests. And it's a funny thing, I found this out a couple of years ago. They'll give you a sign, I mean, if you're watching them, they'll lift a back leg and tell you to go away. And, but if you heckle them long enough, then they'll sting you. But anyway, they're very social, but they live in smaller colonies. The honeybees, of course, have their big colonies, and they're very packed in there. Bumblebees are often down in the soil, just in the loose soil, and there may just be 2 or 3. There may be a few more than that. They have a queen, of course, that lays the eggs, but I always leave my garden pretty dirty. I don't clean it. I used to just have spotless. Clean up every leaf that's out and keep it very clean. You don't need to do that, and you don't want to, because there are lots of little bugs that are just wandering around there, and that protection. Through the winter, I leave almost everything. I love watching the birds come get the seeds, but it also is protection for a lot of those creatures that have laid eggs and are underneath all of that. So, but anyway, that's what bumblebees look like when they're cleaning. That was on a salvia that was in my some pots. This was the same spot, but he had cleaned it up a little bit better. This is more about the bees. If you have roses, you've probably seen cutter bees. Or if you haven't seen them, you've seen what they do. They cut out neat little circles off of your leaves. That's fine. They take those little pieces back. That's how they build their nests. And so you want to, get happy if you see them like that. The sweat bee is, I just put that out there because it's attracted to sweat or the salt, anytime it can find that salt. These are primary pollinators for fruit pots. Again, a lot of them nest underground. Some of the solitary bees, and you'll just find 1 or 2. Some of them nest in dead wood. If you have trees that branches have broken off of, or some areas that have died, always leave a little bit of that. Not only is it good for the pollinators, but there are plenty of birds, owls, other birds that nest in those dead areas. So it's always good to be a little bit messy. Birds, again, hummingbirds are the most familiar. I love feeding them. I always have feeders out. They say that you don't need to do that. I think it helps. I know it definitely helps, especially when they're migrating. If they see areas, towns, villages, cities, and they can find some color and they can come down, almost always they'll find us, putting out our feeders, and they're able to get some of that nectar. It's also, we have somebody who's really excited about this, I can tell. But they have to have that nectar, and when we provide the nectar, we help those hummingbirds to get through the process of raising their young. They also have to have lots of little bugs. I put out old fruit, just throw pieces of bananas, even just banana peel, and peaches, nectarines, things like that out of my garden, because they attract gnats, little tiny bugs, And hummingbirds have to have that protein. They don't just survive on the nectar, they need that protein also. In the tropics, they pollinate bananas, papaya, nutmeg, a lot of other things that provide us with seasonings. Without those seasonings, we wouldn't have the flavors that we have. We wouldn't have some of the great flavors that we have in our cookies and brownies and other desserts. This orange hummingbirds, the rufous, I love those guys. They just drive me crazy, and they're always, they come around July, come into our gardens. If you have feeders, all of a sudden there's this guy out there trying to keep everybody else away from them. I call them the red barons, and they're just crazy. But they're migrating through, and they seem to think wherever they go that they can just be in charge. It's estimated by 2050, which seems like a long time ago, but I remember when we had the year 2000, and that was, what, 22 years ago? So the time goes by quickly, but they estimate by 2050 that rufous hummingbirds will be extinct. Their migration routes are being broken up, so as they're migrating, if they can't find what they're used to stopping in for, nectar and little bugs, then they're just going, it's going to be hard for them to migrate. And their migration routes are being broken up, and climate change is changing the flowers, the source of protein. And we can do things to help them by making sure that if one of the examples of breaking up migration routes is when a contractor comes in and buys a big plot of land and is going to put in houses. Well, usually they're charged with having to put in some parks and leave some other open space. But a lot of times what they do with houses is plant, they might do the landscaping in the front of each house and leave the backyard open. Or they'll give you the option of a couple of trees here and there. Almost always they're not native. And we bring in non-native plants and trees, and it doesn't do our landscaping any good. We've broken up what was there naturally. If we can have some native plants, if you can think about native plants, thing that amazes me, and this is just the nature of the beast, but you go to Lowe's in the middle of the summer, and they've got all this huge selection of plants and trees, and half of them just don't even exist in this area. They're from another area. They can ship them all over the country, but people are so excited about having some of these things. They used to live in North Carolina, and here's this tree that they're familiar with, or some bushes, and rhododendrons don't grow here, but they sell them, and it's just crazy. If you do that, you're going to have to provide humidity. You're going to have to provide all kinds of things, and most people just don't know that. So these guys, pollination. I found this picture on the right, but birds are just always sticking their heads in there. These creatures were in my yard, are always in my yard, fortunately still. The flickers, the Geckos, through the winter, they're always on the ground. Orioles, I've had Orioles in my yard 3 times, and I've put out Oriole feeders that I bought at the store and everything, and they just know where they want to go, and it's not my yard, regardless. But they are around.
Not mine.
Yeah. When I lived in Las Cruces, yes.
Which one's the Oriole?
This fellow right there, that's the Oriole, and they're about this big. They're a larger bird, and beautiful when you see them. A lot of times you see them on the ground, ruffling around, and I've seen more of them over towards the river, out off of Rio Grande, and towards the river in those areas, scratching around underneath. The towhees, that's a towhee right there, and they're beautiful birds. They come in the winter. They are around. You'll see them. That big orange eye is beautiful. The flickers, you might not notice them, but every now and then you'll catch a glimpse of them. They are around quite a bit. They're always going up the trees, looking for bugs in the bark, and they also nest up in crevices and in holes. But that's a flicker right there. It's a type of woodpecker. The bush tits or the titmouse, little bitty guys, but have that pretty long tail, but little fat guys, and they chirp like crazy. They just sing, and they travel in flocks, and you'll see them late in the day or early in the morning traveling from tree to tree and into the bushes. And of course the scrub jays, the blue jays, I have them. I live up towards the foothills, and they come down from the mountains. They're noisy and try to chase off other birds, but they're all good pollinators. Let's see here. Okay, this little Rufus was in my yard. He was migrating. He had a tough go of it and was just hanging out. But it just breaks my heart. I mean, I won't be around then, but to think that our children might not see hummingbirds, they're just such a joy and such a big part. And it's not just the Rufus, there's so many other birds. Every day we have birds and other creatures around the world that go extinct. We have a lot of, in South and Central America, on islands all over the world that we've never even investigated. We have creatures that they find a remain of, and that was the last of the species, and we never even knew that it was alive. But there's so many fruits, vegetables, herbs, nuts, all these things. They're pollinated. They each have specialized pollinators. This is one of my favorites. This is the orchid plant that produces the vanilla bee. This is in Madagascar. This obviously wasn't in my backyard, but the vines grow naturally up the trees this way. They grow this way. Some of the vines might be 200 or 300 feet long, up through the trees. That's the orchid. It blooms and is open for less than 24 hours. If it's not pollinated by one single little bee, and it's that stingless, it's a little tiny guy, and he is the only pollinator in the world that can pollinate this orchid. He has the right shape and size to get in there. If he doesn't pollinate within that 24 hours, there's no pod. We don't get the vanilla bee. Obviously, for commercial vanilla, we would never have enough of those little bees. There's a rumor or some story that a number of years ago there was a little boy who was climbing a tree and fiddling around and figured out that if you blew an orchid a certain way and wiggled it and got your finger in a certain place, you could pollinate it. So anyway, they figured out how to do that, but they have obviously people up in these trees following these vines. Madagascar is one of the biggest producers of vanilla. It's also grown in Mexico. We have the Mexican vanilla. It's one area down there, and they have their own little stingless pollinator. That guy just doesn't live anywhere else. They've tried, but it doesn't happen. They have tried growing these vines in commercial greenhouses. It's so difficult. So a lot of it, it's just when they see the blooms, they make sure that it's pollinated. They have all of this labor, and if they happen to get it pollinated, we get a seed pod. It takes about 9 months for this process to go through. The seed, the flower develops the pod. It has to ripen on the plant for up to, I think it's up to 9 months. Then it can be, they can remove it, and after that, and they developed this long before we had any commercial idea about it, but they would take the pods out, put them out on the sand near the water, near the beaches, cover them with blankets, and then at night they remove the blankets and let them cool. During the day they cover them again so that they have all of this heat and the moisture, and that helps them to develop, gets to a certain point, and then they go through the process to make the vanilla. But it's a big, long process, and every once in a while hurricanes will hit that island or come through another area. And when they wipe out half of the pollinators or half of the crops, that's why your vanilla prices go up. And it's always going to be that way. We're not going to be able to grow them in New Mexico. We can't even grow them in the south where it's humid. It has to be, you know, there are just certain things that have to happen. So 99%, this is something you look for, 99% of vanilla flavored products don't actually contain any vanilla. It's vanillin, you'll see that written in the description. It's a petrochemical, it comes from wood pulp, comes from eugenol, which is a product of clove oil. It even can be produced from castoreum, which is a secretion from the anal glands of beavers. I don't know who figured that out, but somebody did. But that's what vanillin is. And so when you see that description or you see vanilla flavored, it's not going to have any vanilla in it at all. True vanilla, and in the United States, this is because of the regulations, we have 35% alcohol, and it must contain 100 grams of vanilla beans per liter. The Mexican vanilla is obviously a different combination, and you can purchase it. It describes what it is when you bring it into the United States, and it has a little bit different flavor. But I saw that some landowners even sleep with their trees and plants to make sure that the pods aren't stolen, but also to watch for those flowers, because when they bloom, it's just a short period of time. I don't know if you've ever seen, I've grown a cactus that blooms. It's called the Queen of the Night, and it can't stay outside during our winters, it's too cold, but in California, sometimes those cactuses will be huge. The blooms, you'll see it coming, growing. It has a stem on it about this long that grows out from the side of this funny looking cactus. And it's got this hairy part, and then at the end you'll see the bulb growing. And the hairs will start to stand out just before it's getting ready to open. It's called the Queen of the Night because that flower opens for about anywhere from 6 to 10 hours through the night. I've had them, and I'm watching them finally go out at midnight, and it's opened, and by 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning it's gone. So it's, you know, that's these landowners are looking for those blooms. This is another specialist, another example of a particular creature that has grown and is the only creature. This orchid is called the Darwin's orchid. It's a star orchid. Darwin was given one. He never could find the pollinator in his lifetime. Shortly, or a few years after his death, someone did find the pollinator. It has to be something that could get down into that spur that's on the backside. That's where the pollen is. And so you can imagine that there are a lot of creatures. A beetle couldn't get in there. That's the creature that pollinates that. It has a proboscis. This one that they found, the proboscis was 18 inches long. It's a moth about this big, but that's the only moth that can get, and they can smell where that orchid is when it's blooming. They, if you see moths and hummingbirds, they have their proboscis curled up right under their nose, and when they smell that, they back up. It's fascinating. You can see it on the internet. You can see everything, but they back up, put their proboscis out, somehow get it down in there, and get the pollen and the nectar, and that's how it survives, and that's how that orchid survives. So it's just another example of all of these. This is an example. How many of you love figs? I do. Well, there is one particular wasp that pollinates. This is an example of it. The female wasp finds, oh, well, this is another thing. You never see flower for a fig. Have you ever seen a flower on the bush on a fig tree? They don't flower. The flower is inside the immature fig. And it's one of the few things, fruit or vegetable, anything that has the flower inside. The wasp finds a soft spot on the immature fig, crawls in. It's usually through a hole that a male has drilled to get out, goes in to the center. Usually that female has come from another fig. Well, it would have, because that's where the eggs are laid. Carries pollen, goes into another fig. The flower is in there, crawls around, pollinates that fig, lays its eggs, and dies. When the eggs are hatching, the males always hatch first, and even though the females are still in the egg state, they will mate with them, and then the males will leave. They'll find a spot and drill out of the fig, so they leave this little tiny tunnel that if you look at one that you brought in from the backyard, you probably never noticed any of these things going on. It's quite small. The male will go out. The females will hatch. They've already been mated. They will crawl around the flower there, gather pollen, find one of the tunnels, and go out. The males die once they leave the fig. The females will live. They'll go out, they're covered with pollen. They'll go out and find another fig, crawl into that one, and that's where they pollinate the next flower, lay their eggs, die, and then the process goes on. But if you open up a fig next time, take a look in there, and you're not going to find all of these things. They all have, disappeared. You don't see it. It's all just part of the center, and the flower is in there. There's one thing though, most commercial figs are sterile, so they're not pollinated by these bees. So, the wasps. So a lot of that's not in there. But if you have anybody who has fig tree or you have some in your yard, bring them in and take a look. All of the natural ones have that process going on. It's pretty interesting. But again, there's only one wasp that can do that. Obviously a bird's not going to be able to anything like that. Honeybees. Honeybees, this is one of the biggest things. There are about, I think it's close now to 100,000 acres of almonds in California. They're all in one big area. It's called monoculture. And when they do something like that, you can imagine for 100,000 acres of almonds all blooming at the same time, they're just not going to have enough pollinators, and there's only one honeybee that can pollinate it, almonds. Beekeepers from all over the country, this is where they make most of their money. They gather up their hives and their bees, and they go out to California during this 2-week period, when it's 2 to 3 weeks, when the flowers are evident and they turn their bees loose. They get paid a bundle to pollinate all of these almonds. When the blooming period is over, they gather up their bees, because honeybees will go back to their homes, to their own little colonies, and they leave town and go back to where they came from, all over the United States. But without that, we would not have almonds. And almonds, almost all of the almonds in the United States come from that area. But it has to be done during that 2 to 3 week period, and it's just that one pollinator. Beetles, nothing else can do that. This one is really dear to my heart. This is a midge. It's the teeniest little thing you can imagine. It grows in close to the equator. It is responsible for pollinating cacao. Without this little guy, we don't get chocolate, and without that, we just don't have the seeds. If you've ever seen a cacao tree, that's what it looks like. The pods hang off of the sides. It's pretty haphazard looking. They have to be pollinated. They have to grow to a certain size, and then they're harvested. They've approximately 1/3 of the world crop is lost each year because of plant pests. So they're constantly trying to get these growing. It's a huge process. There's such a demand for it, but it's about a $50 billion a year business worldwide. A lot of these are, but again, with everything, if we don't protect them, and if we don't keep seeds coming, and if we don't get new plants coming, then we're going to lose the pollinators, and we're going to lose the plants. This is a bat. You can see his head. This is a side view, not from my garden obviously, but their head and doesn't show his tongue, but they can go deep into these flowers. the bats pollinate the flower that produces tequila. And down in Mexico, of course, it's a huge crop, and the tequila farmers started harvesting their plants before the flowers came. They allowed a few flowers because that's the only way they get seeds. That's the only way they get new plants. But they broke down the diversity, and they ended up with disease that recently killed off more than a third of the agave plants in some areas. And it was purely because they didn't allow the process to go through for the seeds to generate, for the diversity to come about. But the farmers have learned since then that, or well, some of them have, it's still happening down there. But it's such a big industry, they've got to let that whole process happen. But bats are it's the only creature that pollinates tequila, so if we kill off our bats, which a lot of people think we need to do, there's so many mysterious things about them. They're really beautiful creatures. I'm a little crazy. I mean, I love the bees crawling on me and everything, but they're all just, all they want to do is just eat, drink, and pollinate. They're not interested in bothering you or hurting you. And if we just take care of them, and if we don't use the herbicides, and that's another thing, I forget about this as I'm going through, but there are areas where they have convinced farmers, when you have an area that's growing all alfalfa, you see fields of alfalfa, and you can see they're sectioned off because of ditches for irrigation, or the landowner, they're in between those areas naturally because the alfalfa's not growing there, or another crop. It's going to be prone to weeds. And so what's the first? You can spray for weeds. What's going to happen next? More weeds are going to grow unless you plant something in there. So what we've convinced, I include myself, what others have convinced farmers and growers to do is to plant flowers, just to plant native flowers through those areas. That'll keep the weeds from coming. It'll also help the pollinators. It gives them more pollen, and it attracts. It's good for the soil. It holds it down, keeps it from eroding. And so if you, in some areas, they've convinced, it's a hassle, just like anything else. And people are resistant to that. They want to do the easiest thing, but sometimes we just have to slow down and think about the fact that we've got to have these other things. And so planting in between the fields makes a difference. These are some other pollinators. This little guy, he lives in Australia, and you can see that obviously his nose is a certain shape, so he's going to pollinate a certain plant. Geckos are pollinators. They don't have hair or anything, but they do have a skin that attracts pollen, and they can pick it up on their feet, which are sticky, and move that pollen. Lemurs, cats, wild cats, all of those creatures can help to pollinate. This picture was at the zoo here in Albuquerque, and you don't think about giraffes as being pollinators, but if you ever see nature programs, you see them in Africa, and they're chewing on the tops of the acacia trees. You'll see them They have those big thorns on them, but they also have beautiful flowers. The giraffes are up there. They end up with pollen on their heads. They go to the next tree, and so they pollinate also. You know, there are all kinds of creatures, and obviously they have some fur on them, but I saw these guys and just thought that would be a good example. This is just more information, a lot of what I've said. Human-induced changes in pollinator populations, pesticides, development where they change the scope of what's natural there, what grows, changes. They may, instead of having a variety of plants, it may be a whole area of almond trees, and they've taken out the natural composition. We have to try and compensate for that so that we don't, if we had all monocultural cropland from one to the next, we would completely knock out any natural migration route, any natural areas for nectar or for pollination. We've got to have some of what's natural come through in all of those areas, and to think about it. Otherwise, it can just be a collapse, one thing after another. There are certainly plenty of groups, and we're doing lots of, I keep saying we. I'm doing it in my neighborhood. I give everybody parsley plants and hand out caterpillars when I can, but that's about all I've been able to do. But just talking about it, and in your garden, and then in your neighbor's garden, or just thinking about the fact that what's native to this area, and you can find all that information on the internet. There is, you know, you can usually tell, go to the extension articles for areas. Those are usually, well, you know, they would be certainly more reliable than some of the others, but there are a lot of people studying these. The more I learn about it, I haven't put anything on the internet, but just talking about it to people and helping people to understand, like what happened in our neighborhood 3 years ago with that spray. That was something that was completely unavoidable. And it turned out, unfortunately, to be the city that was doing it. But I also have had neighbors that are out spraying, and the drift comes over, and you'll find that all of a sudden there's a part of your, I had a neighbor that, I mean, it just, I guess, well, I know I'm crazy about this stuff, but this beautiful pinon tree. I live in a residential area. I have a small backyard, a large front yard because I'm on a corner. Then my neighbor and two neighbors behind me. One lady doesn't like needles in her rocks. She doesn't want any pine needles in her rocks. So any branches that, and you can do this is just fine. I'm not saying that she's wrong. She cuts off any branches that hang over. But what you don't understand is when we have wind or a breeze, you're going to get needles from a block away. I get flowers from mimosa trees. I know where the mimosa trees are. They're about a block and a half away from me, but they're in my yard all the time. I get the seed pods, so it's going to travel. And if you live in a residential area and you have less than 5 acres, it's just going to happen. And there was a beautiful, two beautiful pinon trees next to me, probably 25 years old, 30 feet tall. hung over into my yard, and I considered it part of my landscaping because I built my when I moved into my house, I had astroturf and a dead juniper in the corner, and that was it. So I took all of that out, and I created berms and levels and went crazy and did all kinds of stuff. But the branches hanging over were wonderful. I fed the birds, so the birds were up in the trees. Well, one day I came out and heard these saws and looked over, and both pine trees next to me were taken down. And the reason was, pure and simply, there was nothing wrong with them. I even got a section of one of the branches that trunks with no disease. It wasn't any beetle damage or anything like that. The couple that had moved in, the husband did not like the needles in the yard. And because they could pile up and then you'd have, it could, what was it? They begin to rot and mat, and you can have some growth under there. It just was all crazy. So now in the corner of the yard, and I looked there where this beautiful, huge pine tree was that was full of, I knew of 2 hummingbird nests, and there were birds in it all the time. And I even went over and during the process begged, unmercifully. It was just like, here I am, I'm embarrassed, but please don't take the tree down. I'll do anything. I'll even clean it up for you every week. I'll go over there and take care of it, and of course all that. And then the fellow shows up who owns the company that's cutting the tree down, and it costs about $400 or $500 to do that. So, because they had about 8 or 10 people back there working, cutting off branches and sawing it down. And of course, it's in a small backyard. And when they started to they'd taken the branches off, except for the top part, which they didn't get up to. But they have all these ropes on it, and they're cutting it, and they're trying to pull it down. And all of a sudden, it comes toppling down and takes out part of their back porch. Well, part of the $400 or $500 is to repair some of that. But anyway, I was there begging the woman I said, I'll do anything, please. And the guy shows up and he says, I'm calling the police, you're trespassing, get off this property right now. And the woman speaks mostly German, some English, she's been in the country for a while. And she just looked at me. And so I left, but that was his business. And then, he also had told her that the tree might be diseased, and that it could fall onto my wall, and then she would be responsible for paying for, all this stuff. So, and then there are the crazy people like me who are begging you not to do it. So they're both extremes. Anyway, let's see. Up to 80% of urban landscapes planted with exotic flowers, shrubs, and trees. Native pollinators are disappearing. Let's see. About 90% of the world's plants and 75% of food crops are dependent on pollinators to successfully reproduce. That's to make the seed, to grow the new plants, to keep it going. The decimation of these, except for those that are pollinated by wind or water, tomatoes are pollinated by wind. They also, you'll see bumblebees around your tomato plants. The way that their wings buzz, it's, what's it called? I forget. Anyway, that certain type of buzzing is what makes the air around those tomato flowers vibrate so that the flowers are But you can also do that by shaking your plants. I mean, it's the whole thing. But other than that, I mean, apples, broccoli, the things that have flavor and are flavor-producing, nutmeg, other seasonings like that, all of that would disappear. And when that all starts cascading, we're going to lose those other things that are pollinated by wind or water. These are some great things to put in your yard. The main thing you want to think about for plants or for creatures like beetles or butterflies, they have to have a landing pad. You're not going to see a butterfly coming up to a little trumpet-shaped flower like a bee or a moth or a hummingbird. They have to have a landing pad. So you've got to have some of those zinnias are just great flowers. A place for them to land, and then they can do their what's natural for them, their pollinating. But a lot of these, but some of the important ones are just the what am I trying to say? The salvias and the penstemons. Those are native to our area. And although there are a lot of exotic types, if you can get the penstemons and the salvias growing in your yard, you're going to have all kinds of pollinators. Plus, they're just beautiful plants. And I don't know if you've ever seen a Palmer's penstemon. It grows in the desert like crazy with no water and the dry area. And it can have a stem on it this big, has beautiful pink flowers. And it's just native to our area everywhere. There was a bunch not too far from me, and they cleared a whole area for a parking lot. It was next to a police station, so I guess it was what had to happen. But they just went in and mowed it all down, and that's the way it is. Growing up, my cousins out in California, where I took the pictures of the wildflowers that fortunately are still there because they're valleys and they're remote areas and they haven't been able to get them. But all of my mother had 5 brothers. They all had big orchards, peaches and apricots and olive orchards out there. And every one of them is gone now. Every one of those big orchards. And some of them, she grew up on a strawberry ranch. And I remember going to a part of it, and my sister and I would lay in the rows and eat the strawberries, and the hummingbirds were buzzing around. But it's all gone. There's not any of it left. It's all freeways. It's just all, what happens. And but it just, things like that, it's just so sad because we lose. And of course, those were areas where pollinators migrated and were accustomed to having those things. Although it was monoculture, there certainly was enough wild area. But leave your gardens messy. That's one of the things that you can do through the winter to help even if it's just a patch, do that. When you plant flowers or you put anything in, clump them together so that there's an area so that these little guys can look down and find something. It amazes me, the hummingbirds that migrate 2,000 miles. Of course, it's nature to them. It's like the butterflies. It amazes me. First time I watched I found the eggs, and then I watched the caterpillars for 2 weeks. And then the chrysalis, I think it took about 18 days. And then this butterfly, you can tell that it's getting ready to emerge because the area on the outside of the chrysalis turns clear almost, and you can see the butterfly wings underneath. So out comes this gorgeous butterfly, and they're all crumpled up. They're wet, the wings are all crumpled up, and it took about 4 hours for, it was a female, they have certain colors, and so anyway, by then I had taken it outside. I wasn't going to have it inside, and had it on some curly parsley, and explained that she could stay there and she could lay her eggs there so I could have more of them. But of course, that wasn't what happened. But it was she watching as they pump fluids through the veins in their wings, and the wings dry in the sun, and they just straighten out. And in this period of a few hours, what was this little crumpled up mass turns into this beautiful black butterfly. And then it was like, if you've ever seen a single engine plane turn on its propeller, that propeller is just, there's so much energy in it, and they have the brakes on the plane, and they're holding it in place while the propeller is warming up, and it's jerking around. Well, this little butterfly was hanging onto this branch and just flapping its wings like crazy, just getting them revved up. And all this is nature to them. I mean, nobody stops and says, okay, this is what you do next. It just happens. And it happens in a matter of a period of time. And so she gets her wings going, and they're flapping like crazy. And she's holding on and she moves down a little bit more on the parsley, and then lets go and just flies. It's just so amazing. And flew away out of my yard. Oh. And so anyway, I guess maybe they talk, but after all of that process, it's the egg for about a week and a half, and then the caterpillar for about 2 weeks, and then the chrysalis for about 10 to 20, and each one is different for this black Eastern. And then the butterfly lives a week, and that's it. There are others, like some monarchs will live longer. You've heard about the ones that migrate from Mexico and come up, but there are monarchs, parts of them, that only live a short period of time, shorter, and they have to get to a certain point where they can lay eggs in their migration route, and then the process keeps going. It's like with the painted ladies, because I can't remember, I think they live about 2 to 3 weeks. And, but they have to lay the eggs and keep going so that they can get up to an area where they can be warm enough, or, the temperature is right for them to stay for a period of time, and then they come back down. And it's amazing, all of the pollinators. But every little creature, even mosquitoes, and who wants a mosquito in their yard? But mosquitoes and flies are pollinators for certain things, and we have to have them. There's a pollinator for everything, but mainly for the food products that, it's a third to a half of everything that we eat every day comes directly from pollinators, and it's all the good stuff. It's the chocolate and the coffee, mainly, and the artichokes, but the other things that have flavor and are flavor-producing products. So just think about it, and when you talk to people, try not to be as crazy as I am, but just, if they just plant flowers that can benefit. One of the things that I do, I discovered this 2 years ago when I was volunteering at the city greenhouses, and we were putting in a pollinator garden. This is the greenhouse over on Wyoming and Spain. It's the corner of Wyoming and Spain. There's some soccer fields there, tennis courts, and there's some old greenhouses. And I've been trying to get money from the city and the state to rebuild them because they're just falling apart and the equipment is so old. But we planted a pollinator garden that was about 60 feet long. And I just happened, there's a Dollar Tree. I guess they're different dollar stores, but it's called the Dollar Tree. It's on Montgomery at Wantabo next to Sprouts. And they sell boxes of seeds. It's $1, and the boxes are about this big. And they're zinnias or I think they have gardens for shade and pollinator gardens and wildflower gardens for sun and all that stuff. And each box is $1. And on it says it contains at least 5,000 seeds. Well, I figured for $1 that, you know, if I got 10 plants out of it, I was going to be thrilled, because that would be more than I would get from a nursery. And I got more than that. I certainly didn't even get 1,000. But I bought 30 of those boxes, and we sprinkled them all the way along that 60 feet. And we had sunflowers that were 12 feet tall, and they had branches on them that went out 4 feet on each side. And we're just covered with all these different sunflowers and zinnias, tons of them, and some of the other wildflowers. But that was just from the dollar store. They also sell, it's amazing, clippers and little claws, spades and things for $1. And I bought some one year, and I figured if it lasted through the season, that would be great. I mean, it's $1, and we're used to spending a lot. And 3 years later, my clippers are still fine. They're sharper than, probably because they come that way, sharper than the ones that I spent a lot of money on. But anyway, so when you see something like that, just experiment. But they do have some, and I guess that those boxes could have turned out to have a lot of yucky stuff in it. But it came from, I think the company's American Seed Company, and it's a company in the South, which has a reputation. And these are probably the seeds that they would ordinarily throw away, but they're, you know, boxing it. But it was, you know, it was great, and it worked. And so sprinkle, you know, just spend a couple of dollars on some of that and put it out. And make sure that some of it goes in your neighbor's yard. That's another thing about letting your plants go to seed in the fall. And I have neighbors who don't have a clue about gardening, and that's fine. And I don't expect them to. But now they have gazanias and they have zinnias coming up in their yards, and they're delighted. And I'm delighted too, because it's kind of spreading and there's some other spots. So, and I guess that's where those dadgum black swallowtails go. But anyway, any questions? I yak a lot, I know. But I love these things, and I can't remember if I think I had something else after this. Let's see. Oops, wrong direction.
Just a comment, Dollar Tree's gone up to $1.25.
Oh, okay, well, that's Flower. That's my kitty, who's out in my garden early in the spring with not much. But